Hello everyone and welcome to this episode, the Strategic L&D One of the Women Talking About Learning podcast. I'm Andrew Jacobs. Before we start, just hit the like and subscribe button. People find out about podcasts from your likes and your subscriptions, so leave a review to let everyone know what you think of the podcast. In today's fast-paced business environment, we often struggle to align and integrate L&D initiatives with strategic objectives. In this episode, we'll look at how to foster some strategic thinking within your teams. Our first guest is Henriette Kloots. Henriette works as a learning strategist, focusing on helping organisations navigate their L&D challenges. She emphasises the importance of strategic thinking in fostering effective learning environments. Our next guest is Mary Rappaport. Mary is a passionate learning strategist and founder of the Strategic Playground programme, dedicated to developing strategic thinking in organisations. Her extensive experience in the field has made her a thought leader in the L&D community. Our final guest is Anne-Marie Burbidge. Anne-Marie specialises in building L&D frameworks from the ground up, particularly in scaling businesses. Her proactive approach helps organisations define their learning objectives and align them with overall business strategy. This is a fascinating conversation for anybody who has any interest in learning and development strategy. Recorded in early June 2026, this is Women Talking About Learning. This is Henriette, Mary and Anne-Marie talking about strategic L&D.
Okay, hey Mary, hey Henriette. Strategic L&D is in our hot seat today. So what was on your mind when you thought, this is something I'd love to chat about?
Well, I think I might have actually been the one that put that as a topic in the worksheet. So, as a learning strategist and as the founder of the Strategic Playground program to help develop strategic thinking, that's all I ever talk about. I actually I would like to have $1 or even 1 penny for every time that I have said that word strategic, even in just one day. I could retire. It's amazing. So it's a passion area for me because I think it just makes what we do have that much more value. I don't know. How about you?
Where do you see it? Well, I just wondered where you typically see it popping up. What makes it come up so often?
I guess it's the circles that I'm in. You know, I'm in an L&D community here in the States, ATD. I don't know if that's well known outside of the United States,
It is.
Association for Talent Development. And there's always this desire to come to the table and be part of the discussions and driving the business. And, of course, to do that, you really have to have a good understanding, appreciation of strategy and what it means to be strategic. So I feel like that comes up all the time in my conversations with learning leaders and other people. Yeah. Henriette, what about you?
Yeah, I'm curious to hear before I tell you. I'm curious to hear, what does it mean to you? So what's the definition of strategy and strategic thinking to you? Because I think even that we could talk about for like 1.5 hours, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's because, it's a word that has often been used, but misused as well. There's a lot of people are like, oh, this is really strategic. And what it really means is it's important, and it's important to me, or it's important to this executive. And so in my program, the very first thing we talk about is like, what do we actually mean when we talk about strategic thinking? Like, what does that look like and how is that different? And, I've got 4 key pieces to the definition that we align on, which is it's got to be future focused. So you're thinking about something in the future. You are thinking about work and decisions and the business organism as a system. So it's really systems thinking. And you're looking at where you have an impact. And if you make a change, something's going to happen somewhere. You hope it's the one you want, but sometimes it isn't. Also, you bring in external data. So you're bringing in a perspective or an actual piece of research or an actual valid fact into the conversation. Otherwise, you're in a silo. And then the last piece that I always talk about is the ability to adapt. And it's more than just that ability, but it's the ability to discern something changed. Does that mean we should adapt? Or can we stay the course because that's just noise? And so especially in change, the incredible pace of change in business, which is almost at a ludicrous speed, we really need to develop the ability to discern when we need to make a major shift or when, we can stay the course. And so that's what I always start and as a working definition of what do we mean when we talk about strategic thinking.
Yeah, I think what resonates, first of all, is that future thinking. If you ask me, so I work as a learning strategist too for organizations, mostly with learning and development teams within the context of their organization. And what I see is if the organization is all about short-term thinking and symptoms treatment, then, almost always does L&D get pushed into the order taker role where they're not supposed to think more strategic. And I think that's where most of my conversations go into. So it's not future oriented. It's not about where do we want to go and how do we, are still there in 5 years time. It's all about we need something now. We need it to happen. And additionally, not thinking about the bigger picture that it's part of. So a lot of loose short-term initiatives that we think will, be bandages for now.
Yeah, and it resonates with me as well. And actually, where I'm a little bit different, I typically work with organizations that don't have in-house learning and development. So I will often be starting learning and development from scratch in scaling businesses. And I think the only things that I would kind of add to that is, for me, strategy is very much intentional. So rather than let's just kind of do loads of stuff and hope something sticks, something works, it's about really understanding where as a business we need to go, what we need to deliver that, and then how a learning and performance team can help deliver on that. And also it's the proactive end of what we do. I think so much learning and development narrative is around waiting to be invited, waiting for a seat at the table. It's quite responsive to a problem, as you've mentioned. It's reactive. For me, strategic learning and development is much more at the proactive end. So being intentional about what we need as an organization, but also proactive learning and development from learning and development's point of view. Like, what do we want L&D to be positioned as in this organization? What is brand learning and development? Where is our unique value and our unique positioning?
Anne-Marie, what I think is cool about that is you get to work with organizations maybe before they've even created the misperception that L&D is a service response organization versus you're really helping them think of it as a strategic function to start. Like, okay, we're going to set this up for you, and it's going to have to tie into the strategy of the business, right? How hard is it to change the perspectives of the organizations that you're supporting?
I still have the same challenges, as in quite often I'll initially be contacted or initially be brought into an organization because maybe training is required, that maybe there's a problem. It's typically in response to a problem. And so I'm still in many respects expected to deliver training or facilitate to something. But I do find that typically the organizations I work with are more open to being influenced, persuaded that actually training is only one of the tools in the kit.
Yeah.
It's not the kit bag altogether. And so, I will very early be asking the questions around, well, what does success look like? Where are you going as an organization? What's getting in the way? What are the problems you're experiencing? And that's kind of where I get to. But again, I have to build relationships first. I have to build influence. I have to build trust. And sometimes that comes from delivering the things that people want initially before we can then kind of start to have the slightly more robust and tricky conversations about what it is they really need. So I'll typically go in with, let's test. It comes back to kind of all the conversations we have around data and impact and measurement. It's like, okay, well, we can try the thing that you'd like to roll out. But let's do the smallest thing possible so that we can test it, see if it works or not, and then we'll go back and maybe think a little bit bigger. I will often know that early training will be one part of the jigsaw puzzle. It's not the whole thing. So yeah, I still have the same challenge.
Yeah, I remember having a great conversation about a metaphor with a client. So we we were talking about building an onboarding program. There was really a lot of issues happening with an onboarding program at a big bank in the Netherlands. And we needed time to really figure out what's the issue, what's happening here, and how can we make it better. And in the end, my stakeholder and I, we butt heads on the fact that he wanted it yesterday, and we needed time to figure out what was going on so we could actually make it better. And then we came to the metaphor of a car. Now, I'm not very a car person, so it was a difficult metaphor, but I got this. Basically, say you're trying to build me a Ferrari, and it takes time to do that. Well, in the meantime, my employees are still going through this journey in a very terrible car that is not functioning. So, and we ended up working with that metaphor and going to, okay, maybe what you need now is an air conditioning put in so that these people are actually more comfortable. And then in the meantime, we can make sure that we see what's actually happening with the car in total. And that metaphor is something I still bring into conversations about this, because people get it. You need something now in order to make a bit of a change and then work towards the bigger goal that you need.
Yeah, Henry, and you could add to that and just say, like, where are we driving to? Like, let's even talk about the destination and the road that the car is on, and let's even challenge if that's even the right way to go.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And these conversations led me down like the product route. So product and agile as a way of working. And I think it's quite well suited for scaling organizations, because this concept of really get to know your audience, really understand the problems, test and iterate rather than kind of big bang. I think, again, a lot of L&D and perhaps a lot of L&D strategy says, let's deliver X number of cohorts of leadership development training over the next 12, 18 months, and we'll budget for that. But actually, how do we know it's working?
Yeah.
And how do we know that's what people need? Again, you talked about the pace of change, which is just wild. And so whatever may or may not work now may not be the right thing in 18 months' time.
It's true. One of the things that, I kind of like to, I don't know, maybe flow the analogy bigger. We talk a lot about our functional expertise and how much we know L&D and how we know the right way to do it. We have to slow down and we can't go faster, and maybe training isn't the answer. All those things, that's kind of still stays and it sort of silos us in this L&D mindset. And I always, with the teams that I work with, whether it's L&D or other operations or finance or IT, it's like, hey, you've got a great set of chops when it comes to your skill set. And you do know that for your growth and for your credibility and to be a more strategic contributor, whatever that, function is, you need to start thinking about the business. You need to start learning the business. And you need to understand how your business, how your function inside of the business is helping the organization achieve its strategic goal. And I think we can get so caught up in that. I need a training. No, you don't need a training. You need to figure out what you need to have. You have all that discussion, but we often just don't step back and say, what's the organization trying to achieve? How does this problem that you're presenting to me show up? And what does that mean? How can we solve this from a business perspective? And then functionally engage with, okay, well, if we all determine that a learning program is something that's going to solve it, then let's lean into that. But I think the biggest challenge that L&D has in terms of being credible and strategic is just be a business person first, and then be an L&D expert second, because that's what the business needs, and that's how you make your team successful. That's how you make your organization successful. That's how you gain credibility in that strategic spot.
Yeah, and I think that's actually what the biggest issue is when it comes to strategic L&D, because there is and will always be this tension field between commercial and education. So in every role I've had over the last 20, 25 years, there was always this tension field of, we need to create something fast, we need to do this, we need to make money. And when you look at it from an instructional design point of view, for example, or from an educational point of view, if you want to build something that's absolutely brilliant from an educational point of view, it will always be too expensive, too big, too heavy. So I feel to overcome that tension field in between the commercial side and the educational side of things, you will always have to have a conversation with the people that understand business. And I think if you are an L&D expert and you are trained as an L&D expert, you have the skills to create brilliant programs, but you don't understand organizations in general. So I completely agree with what you're saying, Mary, because and those are the skills that L&D really misses. They miss true project management. They miss performance consulting. They miss marketing and sales, and not because they couldn't do it, but because they've been never asked to do so. And the organization's not asking it from them either.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, L&D, first of all, it's vernacular, right? So you can call it training and you've already lost if you start saying the word, well, it's training.
Yes.
If you look at L&D, it's the D that we care about, right? It's the development. So you got to build something. You're building and developing people. And, maybe some of the closest vernacular that really resonates with the business is performance, the performance management pieces of it, the performance development pieces of it. And I've seen organizations that have adopted that mindset and they go faster further because the language is the language of business and not just the language of L&D. I think
Yeah.
that matters.
But that's what we're doing the D for, right? The
Right.
performance of the organization. So the performance of the people and the teams they sit in, which roll up and compound into the performance of the organization. That's what the D is in service of.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah, it's I think it's interesting. One of the things that I was thinking about when you were talking about not being not just a learning and development expert, but being a business expert, it's like in your experience, where have you seen that pivot happen? Because of course, there's kind of a period in time where you're the learning person, but then you're suddenly in these conversations when actually now I need to be more a collaborative business leader. So I'm now not just a learning person. I'm an enterprise leader.
Yeah.
And I see this consistently across all functions, actually, but particularly from a strategic L&D point of view, where do you see that pivot? Where do people start to build that business acumen as well?
My experience is when they realize they need a strategy for learning and development that's an enterprise-wide strategy that supports the achievement of the strategic goals of the organization. So that if there is, I mean, I'm like you, I'm often invited into an organization to help them build that. And sometimes an external perspective helps that awareness develop. But when someone inside the organization begins to take that on and begins to say, oh, okay, I'm supposed to create something that's a bigger picture of everything that supports, maybe not just one aspect of the business, but fully challenges the business's direction and how we get people to have the skills and knowledge and talents to achieve that and where the gap is. I think for me, the very first time I built a learning strategy, I had this amazing sort of insight about what I needed to accomplish with it and who I needed to touch and who my stakeholders were that I wasn't thinking were stakeholders and the voices that I needed to bring into the conversation. So I see a lot of aha moments when learning leaders for the very first time are involved in building that strategy, whether it's partnering with an external consultant or they're leading it on their own or they're part of the project team. I see the light bulbs go off and they see themselves differently from that point forward, I think.
And I think in addition to that, Anne-Marie, and I'm curious to hear what you think as well, because I'm sure if you do organizations where L&D is not yet accomplished, let's put it like that, or established, then you have different kinds of conversations. But I come in where there's an L&D team and they're struggling, trying to keep their head above water with all the stuff that they're doing. And then on the other side, I'm calling it that, but it's not fair. On the other side is the organization that is wanting a lot of things, but doing a lot of things in a rogue way because, L&D is slowing them down. I know I'm painting it very black and white, but that's often what it is. And what I see, if to answer your question, is that, yes, you need the bigger picture. And additionally, the success experience of bringing the two of those sides closer together is what helps them both grow. So it's not just, from my experience, not just L&D trying to be more of a business partner, understanding how to have those conversations, but it's also the organization, educating the business on what learning and development really is. And when they have success experiences together, which could be on multiple levels, but mostly it's on big strategic programs, they see, hold on, this is the value of having people in there that understand learning. And this is the value of me putting my 2 cents in, what it means for the organization. And when they have those joint success experiences, that's when I see it growing and becoming more together. How about you?
Yes. Well, so actually, I typically will join an organization when, and I'm working with people who are already thinking in quite a commercial way, quite a strategic way. And so I would say in some respects it's easier, because I think a huge part of this and a big part of the challenge, particularly for in-house learning and development teams, is being the driver for that shift in understanding what learning and development is. So like what brand L&D is. We've touched on it already around the vocab, the language is just one thing. It's the work you're doing and the impact that you have that matters. But, it's for me, it's about getting under the skin of it. We talk about learning, we talk about education, but what's the why? Like, why are we interested in people learning something different? Why are we interested in skills and abilities? Why are we, and for me, that's just the tip of the iceberg, because then we might have some amazing people with amazing skills and experience and knowledge, but how do we create an environment where they can all work together really, really well? And so that then starts for me touching on things like culture and like the ability, like feedback and kind of continuous improvement, those sorts of things is, that's what we're looking to achieve. And being closer to customers, the business's customers. So learning and development's customers are often internal employees, but the business's customers are really, what we're kind of trying to get to. We're trying to, typically most organizations, they're looking for revenue and sales and customer retention, customer attraction. It's about profit. And so, that for me is the why that sits beneath all of it. And if we can connect into that, like the learning bits, like the journey, it's not the destination.
What I very often see happening is that L&D is trying to convince the business or tries to convince people in the organization that they need to do stuff or understand stuff. And I always tell them, if you feel that you are trying to convince the other person, you're putting energy in the wrong place. What you need to do is understand them better. Like, ask yourself the question, what keeps you up at night? If you're the CEO of the company or you're the marketing director, whoever you are, what keeps you up at night and how can we help you in that sense? And then you have a completely different conversation and trying to convince them that learning objectives and performance objectives are relevant, right?
Yeah, yeah. And, for me, it's like, you have to know how you make money as a business. How does this organization attract customers, retain customers, make money, and just be able to have those conversations? Yeah, I mean, it's just, sometimes I kind of struggle with this conversation because it's kind of just, for me, it just makes sense. It's common sense. Oh yeah, because otherwise learning is just, isn't it a beautiful, nice to have and makes people feel good and we have a nice day out? Well, that's great. And I'm not saying that's never relevant. I'm not saying it's never good to create a positive experience. But actually, when as an organization you're investing in it, and typically I'll be working in scaling organizations that are time and cash poor. And so anything that takes people away from the work is costly. And it has to be justified. And so unless it's contributing to ultimate business success, I'd have a really hard time justifying my existence. And so that's my starting point, not my end point. So I think, like you say, a lot of established teams are having to kind of re-establish brand learning and development. And like I go in almost knowing that I've got to do that, but I think I've probably got a slight head start because I've not got the history that a lot of other L&D kind of organizations might have. Although I had done it in-house, and I did pivot it in-house with a big team as well. So that's possible too.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, Anne-Marie, and also you, Henriette, if there is a difference in maybe the size or the type of company, do we see any differences across, any of the demographic pieces of a company makeup that makes them more or less encouraged or apt to look at L&D from a strategic perspective?
I would say I've seen it all almost, and it's not necessarily about size of the company. The Netherlands is a country where we have a lot of small, medium enterprises, far more than we have big corporates, although we're known, of course, for Heineken, et cetera, and Philips. We have those, but they're, very little compared to the SMEs that we have. And it has far little to do, I think, with the size of the organization, unless you have a great like strategic L&D leader that's in-house. But if you don't have them, it's far more about the maturity of the organization and about the maturity of the L&D team that says where they stand. But honestly, and I really like to hear Anne-Marie's opinion on this, I, I have become more and more cynical over time. Cynical sounds terrible, but I've seen so many L&D kitchens. I always call it L&D kitchens. And in every L&D kitchen, something else is happening that might be a problem. So with one, the faucet is leaking, and with the other one, the fridge is not stocked. And I see it as a challenge to find out what's wrong in this kitchen and how can we make it better. And very often that sparks a strategic conversation, obviously. So my cynicism comes from even those organizations and those L&D leaders that are at conferences speaking and doing major business cases and cases putting out there. And when you come in and you have a proper conversation about L&D is running, there's still always something that can be improved. Now, they can be more mature than others, but when there's a new project coming on a new strategic challenge within the organization, it's still very hard to still have that seat at the table. So I always find it's not a journey that when you get there, you go, oh, now we have a strategic position and now we're fine. It's sort of like an endless cycle that you have to go through and through every time and again. And then a new leader comes in and you have to do that again. So that's a bit where the cynicism comes from. There's always still work to do. And I think strong learning leaders, but also strong senior management in an organization can make sure that that cycle becomes, less long or closer together or whatever you want to call it.
I think our work is never done, though. I think it's part of what it is to be in learning and development. That is, we talked about the pace of change. Like, even if we just touch on technology, like the rapid kind of iterations in technology, even out to kind of macroeconomic factors, there is just so much going on all the time. And again, if we're not just looking purely at skills, the ability to do the work, but we're also looking at the system that people are operating in and the environment in which we are able to set them up for success or not, like that's just constantly moving. And so I think, the landscape that any organization's attempting to be successful in at the moment, never mind the individuals within it, is just super complex. Our work is never done. We might solve one problem. Like you say, it's a little bit whack-a-mole, isn't it? And I think, again, for me, that's why I really like the idea of things like a backlog, because what that does is we can kind of go, what's all the things that are going on at the moment? What are all the things that we could do? But then getting really strategic about narrowing down and absolutely nailing priorities and measuring impact. And I think that for me opens slight can of worms, that is, how good is data in the organization and how good is your data analytics as a learning and development team or professional? How good is your storytelling using data? Because whilst there's so much that's relevant across all different organizations, it almost doesn't matter. I work mainly with growing organizations, so typically kind of under 500 people, but I work with some huge organizations too. And, the ability to get your hands on the right data, is it good quality data, and then do something with it, is very variable.
Mary, when you started out talking about the topics that you discuss when you talk about strategy, one of them was impacts and external data. Can you, now that Anne-Marie has opened up the can of worms of impact, can you tell a bit more about how you do this in your work? Because you speak to leaders that are also not L&D leaders, right? So how do
Right.
you have a conversation about having the right data?
Well, I think the conversations when I talk about impact and strategic conversations, and are you thinking or engaging strategically versus are you in your own silo? I try to bring a few tests to bear. It's like, okay, let's take a look at who is in this conversation. And are you considering that there's someone missing? So just really challenging them to say, is there a perspective, a person? Have you talked to a learner? Have you talked to a customer? And okay, great. If we're all at the conversation, then what are the assumptions that we're bringing? Like, let's write them down. Like, what do we know is true? And so one of the things I do is like, let's just write down, what do we know is true about this? Write that down. Okay. Now, let's look at those truths and let's figure out which ones of those are assumptions and which ones of those are from our experience. Like, oh, I just, everybody knows this. It's obvious. Or, yeah, that's how this works. It's, why would we even question that? And really saying, where of these things that you say are true, are there opportunities that someone else might have a completely different perspective on that? And so what data or information or proof do you have that helps you? And I can at least identify an assumption. And so, we got to work with assumptions, right? You can't, you can't have, proving every single thing through data. But if you're not willing to identify where you are, maybe making an assumption because you don't have the data to justify it. The next piece is, okay, we acknowledge that. So now what are the risks if that's wrong? Let's go into this looking with our eyes open and say, if we move forward and we just continue and we're making this assumption, what would go, what if we're wrong? What could go wrong with that? And I think, so when I talk about data, it's not necessarily proving the impact of the work. It's really proving the impact of a lack of data and a potential for, hey, if we don't acknowledge that we operate with assumptions in this initiative, then we could run into some things. So let's be strategic about it. Let's prepare. Let's really look at, where we might be blind to something. So I kind of think about it in a different way. I think a lot of L&D leaders are all about, we've got to prove our value. We've got to use the data and prove that what we're building is really adding value. It's really interesting to me that there are so many functions inside an organization that do not feel that burden. When have we asked finance to justify that the investment in what they do, systems, et cetera, is going to be, we can prove it with data? Or operations, they do a lot of measures. So I guess operations would be one that they could absolutely point to data because that's where they truck. But it seems, and sometimes I think it's interesting, we feel more obligated to prove with data what we do. When, again, going back to assumptions, it's very, very clear. We all know that if you teach someone to do something better, you're going to have a better output. So the right data versus just data in that case, I guess.
I think the other thing you're hitting on here is this concept of mindset and the belief. The other thing that it's kind of raising for me is this spirit of whether you start business and then work your way back, or you start at L&D and then try and push it forward. And actually, if you start from the organization, the people, the work they're trying to do, the metrics that matter to your organization, the metrics that matter to your customers, and then go, well, let's look at how we develop and align our people behind that, you don't really have the gap that is impact, because you've started from the point that matters and everything you've built in service of that. If you squirrel away as a learning and development professional and go, well, I've got this fabulously designed learning intervention and I have to now somehow sell it and give it the razzle dazzle. Yeah. And then I have to prove to you it's good. That's a different, you will always have to kind of you'll struggle for the buy-in and you'll struggle for the kind of the brand and the reputation of your team because you're starting in the wrong place. Absolutely. It's not like, let's do a fab L&D thing and get it out there. It's the other way.
Yeah, starting in the wrong place and at the wrong time, because it sort of feels like, oh, we've already done this. Now see how we're going to measure it. And I always say to L&D professionals, if you want to know whether what you're doing is going to make sense, you need to analyze that in your analysis phase and not where you're designing or developing the learning solution. When you're doing the analysis, you should try to figure out, like you're saying, Anne-Marie, what's at the back end of this? What is actually the problem that we're trying to solve? What's the data that's going to back that up? And, the ancient old argument of, the ROI cannot be shown that this learning intervention actually led to this. I'm not supposed to swear on a podcast, but I think it's nonsense.
Very politely handled. Well done.
Okay. Because I think if I look at the programs that learning teams have built that were the most successful were about transformation. They weren't about the data that says, oh, this sales pipeline was better, or, the retention got lower or sick leave got lower. I'm not saying those data are not important, But if you ask the organizations which programs were the most successful, it were the least tangible ones, where everyone went, okay, we were there a couple of years ago. Now we're here. We're having different conversations. We're having different outcomes of the projects that we're doing. And if you can show transformation, I don't mean to sound wishy-washy, but it's more felt than it is actually shown, I think.
It's really hard.
Yeah, and there's a lot of L&D programs that are built to support transformation. So I think that's a really smart observation. And Anne-Marie, I think that one of the things that you said that I think was interesting was when you begin with the end in mind of the business impact and understand the business, you get obviously a better outcome. Your measures are likely to be closer. But my experience is you don't even necessarily need to invest as much in proving it because they're bought in, right? They're like, oh yeah, you're helping me achieve this thing that I really need that I'm going to be measured on. I know I can't attribute to your point, Henriette. I can't one-to-one say, oh, everybody who put in training time, did helped achieve this much more of that goal. But nobody questions it, right? It's obvious, it's understood, and your credibility, it really increases because it is strategic, because you are aligned on that common, what are we trying to accomplish here? What is the problem we're working to solve? So I love that.
And then when you
Well, I think-
compare that to, when you compare that to a learning and development team who are rolling out big learning programs at the worst timing for organizations, if I had, you said if I had £1 for every time that I'd heard things like, well, we really want to do this, we really want to be involved in this program, but it's end of year, or it's our biggest time for conferences and we're in sales and these sorts of things. And actually, as a learning and development team, it's just a real own goal. If, you are creating support for an organization that just doesn't work around their timeline and their priorities, it's,
Yeah.
that makes
That was
you just making your own life more difficult.
Yeah, and sometimes that is an excuse, right? Like we don't have time for it, or we're not going to put our people through this program or whatever. I think there's something wrong with the buy-in at the beginning of what you have started. If at the end you have to convince people to come, either it's not what they were looking for, or you've not done your due diligence or what the timing was. But very often it's not even about the timing; it's about the topic and how to make sure that that's in line with what people need. I had an example a couple of weeks ago where there was this program that in the healthcare industry that they knew a certain group needed. And they said, we're not going to make it mandatory because then people are going to be resistant. So we're going to make it completely open and people can come if they want to. And I said, all right, but the organization thinks it's very important everyone goes through this in this particular group. And they said, yeah, we do, but we're not going to make it mandatory. Okay, let's see what happens. And then they scheduled it. And you can guess, nobody came because it's not about making it mandatory. It's about making sure that as a leader, you stretch the importance of the stuff that you're doing and how that's helping make people better. And if you talk about strategic L&D, the conversation is very often about, is it fun? Are people having fun learning? Do they want to come? Are they motivated? And I very often think it's not about that, because the organization needs to go from A to B and the people need to go from A to B with the organization. And sometimes that means they have to go through programs or learn stuff they're not entirely motivated to do, but they're part of the organization. They get paid by the organization. So suck it up.
But when we connect that to career and growth and progression, then actually maybe there is a little bit more in it for people. I'm just thinking, if is there one bit of like wisdom or advice you would share with people who are just starting to look at their learning and development strategy? Is there something that you would offer out as a top tip?
Yeah, when I do a lot of coaching with L&D groups to build the more strategic teams, I always tell them, do you know do you understand the business strategy? Do you know how your company is going to win? Are you aware of what the competitive pushback? And if you don't, go ask your marketing team or go ask your executive to say, hey, could you spend a few minutes with our team and really give us, a little primer on the business strategy and how we're going to win this year and what our initiatives are and all of that. I think you get credit for even asking. If you want it, hey, wow, that's no one's ever asked me that before. I'd be happy to do that. Guarantee that'll be the answer. And then you talk about, okay, now that we know this, what role do we need to play? And how does this inform our priorities, how we're spending our time? And what would we say about how we're part of this? And that's what I always tell L&D teams, to start there, because everything else is easier. That becomes the true north.
Yeah, I agree. It's about the conversation at first. It's about building a strong partnership with the people in the organization that are doing strategic work, that are either leaders or others that are, doing strategic work in general, and finding out what's happening in the organization and get out of the L&D bubble.
Mm.
How about you, Henry?
I think my kind of top tip would be really understanding that metrics that matter to the organization somewhere in a room or on a dashboard is something that is tracked meticulously in your organization. And I would really like to know what that is, because if we can start there and understanding that, but also contributing directly to it and managing the kind of the PR and the comms around that, like pointing out those things, then I think that's where we really start to build our influence and our credibility and our strategic direction within an organization.
I'd love to be in the conversations you both have with your clients. I think it would be
Me too.
absolutely fascinating. And I would love to watch how you move them from one space to another. And Henriette would swear.
We'll get a beeper.
Henry would be
A buzzer.
robber.
Yeah, fly on the wall. This is the other challenge. These conversations are happening in pretty much every organization, but it's like people feel super lonely, in having them. And actually, this is where community is important, right? I guess these sorts of things are important, because then you just actually, you learn that we're not in it on our own. Other people are having the same sorts of challenges, same sorts of conversations, and it's wicked to hear from you both about it. So thanks for sharing your experiences.
I know. It's been delightful to know that things are the same no matter where you are in the world. I've really loved getting to know you guys.
Thank you.
Me too. Thank you both.
I love this conversation. I loved how our guests got to the fact that fostering a strategic learning and development offer within your organisation requires a shift in mindset. By defining strategic thinking, being proactive, building trust, and using effective communication, you can iterate based on feedback and significantly enhance your impact. A massive thank you to Henriette, Mary and Anne-Marie for their insight into this topic and for their time in making such a brilliant episode. You will, of course, want to connect with them afterwards, and the details, as always, are in the show notes, along with information about how to connect with us here at Women Talking About Learning, and a list of other material that you might find useful. Please do remember to like and subscribe on your podcast player. We'll be back in a couple of weeks, and next time it's The Connections One. As always, thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.